Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to talk about the secret life of political speeches today. But, we're not going to be sitting in some dry rhetoric class.
Definitely not.
We are going way beyond the textbook to look at something much deeper, something more fundamental to how power is really established and how it's maintained.
Yeah.
The concept is called performative leadership.
Exactly. And this deep dive is all about recognizing that politics, it isn't just policy that's, delivered through a good speech.
Right.
It is inherently a form of theater. We're diving into how leaders use the very act of speaking and the whole spectacle of their actions to establish, and this is the key, perpetually maintain the reality of their own competence.
And their legitimacy. Right, that's the core of it.
That's the absolute core, their legitimacy.
So our mission for this deep dive is to use this academic research as a powerful lens, and it's built on a massive body of, a very specialized analysis.
It really is.
An exhaustive study of thousands of political speeches from Polish leaders, and it covers an entire century. We're talking from the birth of the Second Polish Republic in 1918 right up to 2018.
And the source material here is exceptional, I think, because it moves beyond just theory. It's a comprehensive academic monograph that doesn't just define performative leadership, it grounds it empirically.
How so?
Well, the researchers leveraged the Politerator 1.0 database. This thing has over 1,600 texts in it.
Wow.
And they use it to systematically deconstruct exactly how political speeches in Poland sought to demonstrate their agency, or what the Polish sources call their sprawczość.
Okay, sprawczość. Let's pause on that term for a second because it feels critical here.
Yeah.
We can roughly translate it as agency, but in this political science context, it's more than just the ability to act, isn't it?
Oh, much more. It's the visible, demonstrated capacity to produce intended political results.
To make things happen.
To make things happen, and this is the important part, to prove you are the actor making them happen. It's about being seen to be effective. Got it. And this research shows us that leaders use language and spectacle not merely to, say, deliver a policy update or report facts.
No, it's to prove they possess that sprawczość, to prove they're worthy of the role.
Exactly. And here's where we start to pull the thread. We're going to find out what truly distinguishes a leader, someone who relies on the voluntary support of the people, from just a ruler who relies purely on the apparatus of power.
You mean the entrenched autocrat?
The entrenched autocrat. And what's fascinating here is the underlying philosophical framework. The source material frames politics itself, not just the speeches, as an event.
Or a spectacle.
Or a spectacle. This approach adapts these classic ideas from social theory, specifically Guy Debord's analysis in The Society of the Spectacle.
Right, Debord. Okay, so for anyone who needs a quick refresher, how should we think about that concept?
Well, the shortcut for Debord is to think of it this way. The Society of the Spectacle suggests that in modern life, our social relations are mediated by images.
By content.
By mass-produced content, exactly. So reality shifts away from direct, authentic experience, and it moves toward just its representation.
So for politics, this means leadership becomes less about, the quiet hard work of governance in some back room.
And much more about the visible, compelling act of producing constant, engaging content. It's about commanding the stage.
It sets the scene perfectly for the performative leader. They aren't just ruling, they are performing the act of ruling.
That's it in a nutshell.
So let's start with that foundational concept. How did researchers even land on this idea of performative leadership? It seems to connect, theater, traditional political authority, and modern media all at once.
It's really an evolution of academic thought, and it's been accelerated by technology. For a long time, when academics used this spectacle metaphor, politicians were sometimes viewed as unwitting puppets.
Just following a script set by deeper, impersonal forces.
Exactly. But that interpretation has radically changed.
It's the famous Shakespearean metaphor, all the world's a stage. But now the actors are writing their own lines.
Precisely. Today, leaders are seen as actively centering their entire operation around media activity and intensive, meticulously planned image management.
So they're very much willing participants in their own spectacle.
Oh, absolutely. The performance is intentional, it's strategic, and it is continuous.
And that strategic intention is constantly being fed by the digital sphere, right? The source notes the massive disruptive influence of mediatization.
100%. The proliferation of social media platforms, Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, it's created this relentless 24/7 demand for a new type of leader.
A content creator, essentially.
That's what it is. This is a leader whose primary concern is no longer measured in, say, quarterly policy reports, but in generating short, high-impact content that fills their digital profiles, secures new followers, and produces these rapid, digestible messages that are perfect for scrolling consumption.
And this relentless emphasis, it must shift the political process fundamentally from, deliberation and careful planning to just immediate content generation and reaction.
It absolutely does.
So if the stage is now both the parliamentary floor and the social media feed, how do we define the specific performative action in this new context?
Performative leadership defines the specific actions and interactions where leaders actively construct the very idea of leadership.
Okay.
And this construction uses two primary integrated tools. First, you have wordcraft.
So mastery of language, rhetorical framing, oratory skills.
Exactly. And second, you have stagecraft. This means acting skills, the deliberate actions they take on the stage, how they present themselves physically, their demeanor, their dress, their use of props.
And this isn't a unilateral act. The performance only works if the audience, buys the ticket.
Crucially, yes. Followers are essential participants in constructing this reality. The leadership process is a series of mutually acknowledged performances. It only becomes effective when the audience grants its accreditation to the performance being staged.
And the moment the audience withdraws that psychological validation.
The moment they stop buying the show, the leadership process fails. It's that simple.
That sounds incredibly similar to the classic sociological notion of charisma. I mean, Max Weber defined charismatic leaders as possessing these extraordinary or supernatural qualities. How does the performative view carve out its own distinct ground here?
It's similar because the performative view also relies on creating that impression of the extraordinary, of some unique competence or vision. But the performative approach, at least as it's defined by this research, makes a critical break with classical theory.
Which is what?
The researchers deliberately exclude the negative ethical judgments, things like manipulation or cynicism or outright deception, which are often associated with charismatic leaders.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The goal of the performance itself isn't judged as inherently unethical or manipulative by the researchers. The goal is simply to influence the audience's perception of reality, to secure their voluntary support and make them accept the staged reality as legitimate.
Hold on a minute. That's a massive philosophical claim. If a leader meticulously uses stagecraft purely to secure my accreditation by influencing my perception of reality, and they know the reality is otherwise, if they are acting out a sincerity they don't possess, isn't that the very definition of political manipulation? How can the researchers claim this approach lacks negative ethical judgment?
And that is the central tension of the performative approach, and you've just hit on why it's so relevant to modern politics. The research focuses on effectiveness, not morality.
So if it works, it's good.
In this view, if the performance is successful, the leader is simply demonstrating skill at their craft. The force suggests that ethical concerns become secondary to the ability to maintain flexibility and popularity among supporters.
So the audience is complicit, in a way.
You could say that. Essentially, the audience demands the performance, and the politician is simply meeting the market demand for a certain type of content and image. Therefore, the moral character of the leader is less important than the effectiveness of their performance in securing continued voluntary support.
Wow, that makes the distinction between power and leadership even more vital. We absolutely need to use this framework to establish the fundamental concepts that differentiate a true leader who needs that voluntary support from someone who just holds power, who might just rely on coercion.
That distinction is the anchor for the entire study. We need a clear line between power and leadership.
Okay, so define power in this context for us.
Power relies fundamentally on institutional legitimacy and formal authorization.
Holding an elected office, controlling the bureaucracy, commanding the military, that sort of thing.
Right. It can be maintained using coercive means, sanctions, or the apparatus of the state. And the critical feature here is resilience. The loss of institutional legitimacy does not automatically end power.
Right. A ruler, having lost the popular mandate, can choose not to submit.
And it may continue to rule through force or coercion.
So power is backed by the potential for institutional violence or enforcement.
Correct. Now, leadership is fragile. It is fundamentally different because it relies entirely on voluntary support and accreditation.
That psychological process you mentioned?
Yes, it's a psychologically determined process. Followers grant it because the leader is perceived as the ideal model, the very prototype of their collective goals, and is seen as capable of achieving those shared objectives.
And the consequence of failure in accreditation is immediate.
Absolutely. The loss of that psychological accreditation, the loss of followers' trust and belief in the leader's competence, their sprawczość, it always means the end of the leadership process.
So power can survive the loss of legitimacy. Leadership cannot survive the loss of voluntary support.
That is the difference we have to keep in mind as we analyze the different performance strategies across these political regimes.
If performance is key, then the specific mechanism of delivery, the political speech, is the main vehicle. And this research, rooted as it is in analyzing Polish political discourse over a century, had to wrestle with some highly confusing, overlapping terminology just to build its database.
They really did a great job clarifying the linguistic terrain. The Polish language uses many terms, mowa, wystąpienie, or adzi, expose, that are often used interchangeably in common speech.
Right.
The researchers had to create a definitive taxonomy based on attributes like length, context, and the identity of the sender.
They had to wrestle with all these terms. For us, what's the real difference between, say, a solemn historical moa and the highly specific, policy-driven expose?
Okay, let's start with the broadest category, which is wystąpienie publiczne. That translates to public appearance.
The umbrella term.
It's the umbrella term, yes. It assumes a public audience. It's not just a closed official auditorium. And modern mediatization has made this category nearly universal.
Because everything's public now.
Almost every political pronouncement, from a quick briefing to a formal oration, is now a public appearance that's instantly disseminated across the world.
Then we have morewo, speech or oration. This sounds grand. Something out of Cicero.
It is the category of historical weight. A moa is defined as a long, occasional, and solemn pronouncement directed to a numerous gathering. It carries an attribute of extraordinary circumstance and emotional weight.
So when we talk about the great speeches of history,
We are usually referring to a moa BY. The choice of this term over a more routine word for speech, like kruvenienie, emphasizes that extraordinary importance and often the rhetorical skill involved.
and the highly specialized expose.
The expose is conventionalized and strictly formal. It is typically a very long speech delivered by the prime minister or sometimes key functional ministers like foreign affairs or finance and parliament.
And its purpose is very specific.
It's specifically outlining the government's program and legislative intentions for the coming term. Its key feature is the sender and the intent. It's reserved for the highest members of the executive branch, detailing their policy map.
And it's a big deal.
Its importance is so great that some experts actually argued for including only prime ministerial exposés in the historical database, which really underscores its institutional significance.
This brings us to the actual performance part. Orality versus scripting. In this age of instant analysis and teleprompters, is a spontaneous speech today truly spontaneous? Or is the performance of spontaneity the real trick used by leaders to confirm their språkshusht?
It's the latter. The illusion of spontaneity is a masterclass in modern stagecraft.
Really?
Historically, a truly delivered speech, what they call wigasone, spoken from memory or generated spontaneously, was seen as qualitatively superior. It required immense communicative competence and spontaneous acting skills.
So there was a premium on thinking on your feet.
A huge premium. If you look at the Polish Sejm of the Second Republic, the 10th RP, there was actually a rule against reading speeches directly from a text.
No kidding.
It was weakly enforced, but stenographic reports from the time show parliamentarians reacted negatively to leaders who appeared to rely too heavily on written documents. Reading was considered a mark of disrespect, or worse, intellectual weakness.
But the performance expectation has slipped entirely now.
Completely. The contemporary reality is that virtually all significant political speeches are primarily written by teams of specialists and then meticulously delivered, often creating the illusion of spontaneity.
And modern technology is the accomplice here.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about transparent, specialized teleprompters that are virtually invisible to the audience of the camera. This technology allows the leader to pretend to speak naturally while accurately following a text.
So they get linguistic precision while projecting authenticity.
That's the ultimate fusion of wordcraft and stagecraft. The wordcraft is hidden in the teleprompter, and the stagecraft is the skill needed to deliver it as if it were an unscripted thought.
And in this mediatized age, the visual and nonverbal elements, the comfort they display, the subtle gestures, the perfect timing of a pause, the tone modulation, all of that becomes profoundly important.
It directly affects whether the audience grants the critical psychological support necessary for leadership. It's the mastery over the visual element that often wins the day, regardless of whether the text was authentic to the speaker's own thought process.
Let's move to the engine room of the research. The empirical mission and the pretty surprising results found by testing the historical data. The methodology used was qualitative, employing constructivist grounded theory
Right.
to interpret rhetorical and narrative patterns. So basically, figuring out how Polish leaders constructed their political realities.
And they systematically tested 3 core hypotheses against a century of speeches. Let's start with the first one. Hypothesis 1, the identity hypothesis. This was the one expected to be the political constant.
Okay, what was the premise there?
The premise was rooted in classical political theory and studies of nationalism. The idea that leaders prove their worth by perpetually appealing to the collective identity and core values of the community.
So they act as the embodiment of those shared values.
Exactly. In the Polish context, you'd expect constant reference to shared struggles for independence, faith, or national heroism.
So the expectation was that identity confirmation would be the primary tool for securing legitimacy across all regimes.
That was the safe bet. But the result, not confirmed.
Oh.
Appeals to this deep shared collective identity, the communal core, were not found to be the primary basic tool used by Polish leaders to confirm their political agency.
That is genuinely surprising. It implies that tactical short-term rhetoric designed to manage immediate perception and opponent engagement often outweighs that long-term foundational identity cultivation.
That's a great way to put it.
So what did they prioritize instead?
They prioritized rhetorical strategies linked to the immediate context, defining the enemy, managing follower psychology, demonstrating functional competence. Identity became secondary to situational effectiveness.
Which suggests that modern politics is highly opportunistic in its rhetorical choices.
Very much so.
Okay, what about the second hypothesis, the unification hypothesis?
The premise here was simple, that leaders in power and leaders in opposition, despite having vastly different access to resources, must use similar core confirmation mechanisms.
Why is that?
Because leadership, regardless of whether you have state power or not, requires managing trust and support within your respective political groups. An opposition leader needs to unify his anti-government bloc just as much as a prime minister needs to unify his cabinet.
Makes sense. And the result?
Confirmed. Despite the massive disparity in state apparatuses and media structures, the core rhetorical strategies used by both the governing party and the opposition party to mobilize and maintain the trust of their internal groups remained highly similar.
So the strategies for managing followers and defining external threats were unified, even if the targets were different.
Precisely. The techniques for maintaining internal cohesion are the same, whether you're leading a resistance movement or running the government bureaucracy.
Okay, now for what you said was the most revealing finding, the atemporality hypothesis. This tests whether leadership style is innate and fixed or highly adaptive.
Right.
So the premise being that a leader, if they possess a fixed set of leadership attributes, shouldn't change their rhetoric much, whether they are running for office or sitting in the presidential palace.
Precisely. If leadership were an enduring character trait, the rhetorical confirmation methods should be the same, regardless of the leader's career stage.
And the result?
Not confirmed. And this is perhaps the most crucial finding for understanding political dynamics.
Why is that so crucial?
Because it confirmed that the ways leaders confirmed their legitimacy were entirely dependent on their career stage and power context.
So the performance changes.
Radically. The rhetoric used when campaigning for office, which might rely on emphasizing shared identity and visionary goals, was completely different from the rhetoric used when the leader was entrenched in power and commanded a repressive apparatus.
So the performance strategy isn't fixed. It evolves based on the necessity of the moment and the degree of power or coercion available to the speaker.
You've got it.
This perfectly validates the framework we started with. Leadership depends on voluntary support. Power depends on coercion. When the context changes, the necessary performance changes with it.
The stage determines the script.
The stage determines the script. I like that. The research then provides the empirical substance to this finding by breaking down the context-dependent strategies across 3 distinct regime types analyzed in the Polish context: opposition, governing authority, and the autocratic system.
Right, and to appreciate these examples, we have to remember the historical setting. The Second Polish Republic, the TSECO-RP from 1918 to 1939, was marked by deep political volatility. It eventually led to authoritarian rule under Marshal Piłsudski and his successors.
The Sanation camp.
The Sanation camp. That's vital context.
Let's start with the underdogs then. Strategies of opposition leaders. We're focusing on the anti-Sanation camp during that volatile period between 1929 and 1931. This opposition, known as the Centralu, represented democratic forces challenging the increasingly authoritarian rule of Piłsudski's government. So how did they construct their own legitimacy without any state resources?
Well, their self-construction relied heavily on establishing moral and intellectual authority, not institutional power. First, they adopted the role of parent or educator.
The parent or educator. What does that mean in practice?
Their performance involved explaining complex, often manufactured, objective events to their followers, framing the difficult political situation in a clear, understandable way.
So taking abstract political crises and translating them into simple narratives. Good versus evil, justice versus lawlessness.
Exactly. This constant act of clarification builds immense trust because followers feel guided and informed amidst the chaos.
So they were providing not just a political alternative, but an entire interpretive structure for reality.
You've nailed it. Which leads to the second key tool, framing and defining terms. The opposition would assert specific, non-negotiable interpretations onto abstract, highly debated concepts.
For example?
For example, they might define the strained relations between the executive and legislative power as an uncontroversial fact of government illegitimacy, even when those relations were the subject of intense, ongoing debate. By asserting the definition, they immediately impose a preferred reality onto the discourse.
And the third strategy, flattery or schlebiani, that sounds purely psychological.
It is, but it's strategic and necessary. This is praise aimed at enhancing the audience's self-worth, and consequently, their readiness for persuasion.
How does that work?
Opposition leaders would praise the audience's positive attributes, things like their political maturity, their responsibility, their civic courage. This makes the followers feel worthy of the heavy burden the opposition was asking them to bear, the burden of resistance.
So it transforms followers from passive listeners into vital participants in a moral struggle.
That's the goal.
Okay, now what about constructing the opponent, the governing Senation camp, during this volatile, authoritarian-leaning period?
The core strategy was to undermine the government's competence and moral authority. They used what the researchers called fictionalizing agency.
Fictionalizing agency.
Portraying the government's actions as a mere pretense, claiming the rulers lacked genuine activity or tangible results. The idea that they were just bureaucratic shells.
I think I remember this from the source. One famous opposition speaker, Dabomsky, accused the government of merely turning paragraphs.
Yes, which suggests they were completely divorced from reality, focused only on legalistic details, bureaucratic busywork, and utterly ineffective at addressing national needs.
That's a highly effective rhetorical attack. You're accusing them of being all theatrical form and no practical substance, the ultimate indictment of a failed performance.
And the most frequent tool, however, was the accusation of hypocrisy. This involved pinpointing the lack of consistency between the opponent's stated values, which were often patriotic or democratic.
And their visible, often authoritarian actions.
Right. And crucially, the accusation was often directed at an abstract group, them, the authoritarian Senation camp, rather than specific people. This made the accusation broader, more pervasive, and significantly harder for the government to defend against.
Finally, how did the opposition manage the loyalty of their followers, especially when the ruling party was often aggressive and repressive?
They managed two psychological poles, trust and shared fear. Managing fear was absolutely essential for validation. Opposition leaders emphasized and detailed the atmosphere of fear created by the ruling party.
They gave concrete examples.
Concrete examples of abusive authority, administrative violence, illegal actions. Leaders like Niedzakowski and Rog specifically mentioned how the government used threats regarding employment, housing, or family welfare to intimidate citizens into compliance.
So the opposition confirmed its leadership not just by offering an alternative,
but by validating the followers' shared trauma and resistance to the current fear, positioning themselves as the only shield against institutional terror.
It's a performance of empathy and moral clarity, contrasted with the government's performance of power and rigidity.
Now let's shift to the governing authority leaders in the same period. The Senation camp led by figures like Premier Bartel and President Mushiki. Their strategies are characterized by flexing institutional muscle and controlling the terms of the conversation.
So how did they construct their leadership agency when they already held the keys to the state?
Well, their self-construction centered on inherent right and pure intention. First, they demonstrated agency by controlling the discourse. This often involved ostentatiously breaking formal rules to assert their dominance.
Like what?
For instance, Premier Kazimierz Bartel delivered a lengthy, prepared lecture on the parliamentary crisis instead of presenting the obligatory budget to the Senate. This act asserted their right to speak on any topic, at any time.
It's flexing their institutional muscle and performing a subtle act of impunity.
It's the performance of I am the authority and I define the rules of engagement.
Right.
Second, the constant need for claiming pure intentions. They would relentlessly assure the audience that their motives were noble, entirely patriotic, and driven only by public interest.
Even if the results of their policies were poor or unpopular?
Exactly. This is a crucial performance for securing the credit of trust from voters between elections, convincing the public that failures were due to external obstacles, not internal malice.
And the third strategy, anticipating authority, that sounds like an attempt to preemptively shut down criticism.
It was. They focused heavily on the abstract concept of authority itself as positive and absolutely necessary for state success. President Mushiki, for example, asserted that competence was naturally correlated with holding high office.
The underlying message being, the office makes the man competent.
Therefore, questioning the office holder is questioning the competence of the state itself. They aimed to establish an iron rule of uncritical, automatic acceptance of the object of power.
Moving to opponent construction, how did the governing authority attack the centraloo opposition?
They employed direct, visceral attacks. The most prominent was dehumanization and insults.
Harsh.
Premier Bartel, specifically, frequently used ad personam attacks in his rhetoric. He didn't just argue policy. He attacked the character, competence, and morality of his opponents. He claimed parliamentarians were incompetent, morally decayed, dependent on party bosses, and only interested in the privileges of office.
The imagery he used was often highly disrespectful.
It reduced the opposition figures to petty, self-serving, and morally bankrupt actors unfit for public life. It's pure rhetorical violence aimed at achieving discredit.
And they combined this with what?
With accusing opponents of corrupt motives, Mushiki would claim that the opposition was driven solely by greed or money or the desire for office-based self-interest, rather than the public interest the government was supposedly serving.
So the government claimed noble motives, the opposition was assigned base motives, creating a clear moral hierarchy.
Absolutely.
So if the government had to perform unity, how did they handle legitimate criticism that arose in the parliament?
They used a brilliant, highly manipulative tactic, simulating consensus.
Okay.
This often took the form of conditional criticism acceptance. They would claim to accept criticism, but only if it was constructive, focused on meritorious issues, and didn't harm the interests of the state, all terms defined exclusively by the government itself.
Which is a fictional acceptance.
It is. They effectively reserve the right to deny the validity of any criticism leveled against them, rendering opposition commentary toothless without appearing fully authoritarian.
That's a classic hallmark of power attempting to maintain a democratic veneer.
And they sometimes employed false praise. These were apparent compliments that served as veiled passive-aggressive attacks.
How would that work?
They would highlight the opponent's extraordinary good behavior in one instance, thereby implying that this rare good behavior stood in sharp contrast to their otherwise negative standard conduct. It's a way of saying you did something right this one time, which only confirms how habitually wrong you usually are.
The comparison is stark. The rhetoric required to maintain power is clearly more aggressive, controlling, and focused on narrative supremacy than the rhetoric used to challenge power, which has to rely on moral high ground and clarity.
Now, let's look at the final context, the strategies of autocratic leaders. We're focusing specifically on Władysław Gomułka, the long-standing first secretary of the Communist Party in the 1940s through 1960s. Here, institutional coercion is fully integrated into the state apparatus, which means the performance changes entirely.
When legitimacy is manufactured through party control, how did Gomułka construct his leadership agency?
His self-construction focused relentlessly on projected competence, cold rationality, and obedience to an external ideological authority.
So he emphasized rationality.
Yes, using argument by numbers, facts, and technical details to contrast his position, which was framed as rational and fact-based, against the opponent's arguments, framed as irrational, based on mere emotion or idealism.
And his signature style was dry.
Very dry, technical, often monotonous, and full of dense details regarding economic quotas and industrial output. This projected an image of total control, inevitable progress, and scientific necessity.
That technical style must have been deliberate stagecraft to mask the lack of democratic choice and the ideological rigidity.
It was a performance of control. Furthermore, there was the constant ritualistic element of praising the external power source.
The Soviet Union.
Gomulka's speeches included almost obligatory subservient complimenting of the USSR and its leaders, calling the Soviet Union the homeland of Lenin and pioneer of communism. This reinforces his own position by showing his absolute fidelity to the ultimate source of regime authority and ideological correctness.
So he wasn't relying on traditional Polish heroes then?
Not at all. His approach was the cult of personality and archetypes, but focused on asserting his unique Marxist insight. He used Marxist and Leninist slogans to create a new historical legend for the communist movement, consciously displacing and actively undermining existing Polish national memory or heroes who predated the communist revolution.
He was the architect of a new inevitable history.
He had to be.
Let's move to opponent construction under the autocrat. This must be characterized by intense dehumanization, given the repressive nature of the regime.
Yeah, absolutely. The opponent construction was one of maximum existential threat. Gomulka utilized deep-seated national war trauma to paint opponents as morally corrupt or even subhuman, often comparing them to animals.
And that rhetoric serves to justify repressive behaviors.
Of course. Because, as the source notes, gradual dehumanization allows the leader to justify actions like imprisonment or political violence that would otherwise be morally unacceptable in a normal society.
Who was the explicit target in this rhetoric?
The targets were either generalized, historical failures, or the class enemy. He often used a powerful, discrediting tactic, assigning blame to specific names, but in the plural.
What do you mean?
Blaming Amiga Shembeko for historical failures, using the plural form of their names, was a strategy to instantly and permanently discredit entire previous political camps. It made those names synonymous with national betrayal and failure that necessitated the communist takeover.
And the broader ideological enemy.
Political opponents were universally defined as the parasitic class preying on the working people of cities and villages. The working class was referred to by the famous unifying phrase, Ludu Prakusheko Miastuzi, positioning the party as the sole defender against internal parasites.
So how did Gomulka manage his followers, the working class, under a regime that demanded submission?
The primary tool was the propaganda of success. Speeches painted a relentless, positive, and revolutionary reality of prosperity and continuous development. He cited hard, rational numbers.
Even if they were suspect.
Even if those statistics were highly suspect. He claimed industrial potential was 10 times greater than pre-war levels, and life expectancy had been extended by 18 years. This was an instrumental use of speeches as propaganda to justify all government decisions and establish historical inevitability.
And the key political demand.
A call for unity. This was the core rhetorical element. But in this autocratic system, unity is defined as submission to the party's ideology for the common good. He called for these to gednoksini wisitskitsi, the unification of all forces, asserting that the common good could only be achieved through universal agreement.
Meaning obedience.
Meaning obedience, rather than through negotiation or democratic compromise.
That detailed comparison, the opposition relying on the educator role, the governing authority relying on insults and controlling discourse, and the autocrat relying on rationality and dehumanization, it perfectly confirms the non-confirmation of the atemporality hypothesis. The leader's rhetoric is entirely a direct function of the political power they hold and the context they operate within.
It is the ultimate evidence that leadership performance is context-dependent. It teaches us that authenticity is secondary to adaptability. When you have no power, you must perform moral authority. When you have institutional power, you perform dominance. When you have absolute power, you perform historical and technical necessity.
That was incredibly dense. And it's important to take a breath and reflect on the psychological weight of those performances, especially under the autocrats. All that technical rationale used to mask the simple fact of coercion. It sounds exhausting, both to deliver and to receive.
It highlights the strain of maintaining legitimacy through mere performance. Now let's transition to something concrete. The researchers surveyed experts to create a definitive roadmap of the most critical speeches for the Politerator database.
So these are the speeches that supposedly defined the modern Polish political landscape.
Supposedly, yes.
What were the high-level takeaways from that survey? What biases were immediately apparent in the historical memory?
There were two major structural findings. First, the overwhelming power bias.
Meaning?
Experts overwhelmingly pointed to speakers who held power or were associated with ruling political camps. This confirmed that the available historical record and, crucially, the collective memory heavily favored the discourse of power.
And opposition speeches.
Opposition speeches, even if rhetorically brilliant, were often preserved only in informal circuits or were actively suppressed, meaning they rarely made a historical cut.
So history is literally written by those who controlled the stenographers and the archives.
In a very real sense, yes. The second finding was the profound gender imbalance. Out of over 120 names suggested by experts for the list of important orators, only 6 were women.
Only 6.
And, quite disturbingly, 2 of those 6 women, Nelly Rokita and Kristina Pavlovich, were cited by experts specifically as examples of unserious or aggressive speakers.
Which highlights a clear historical imbalance in recognized political oratory and how women's rhetoric is often framed within the established discourse of power, regardless of its effectiveness.
It's a stark finding.
Let's focus on the speeches that experts did agree upon. The research produced a list of the top 10 most important speeches, indicated by 50% or more of the experts surveyed. If these speeches are the historical backbone, they must embody the pinnacle of successful political performance and context dependence.
They do. These 10 speeches chronologically mark the great transitions and crises of the modern Polish state.
Where does the roadmap begin?
It begins with number 1, Józef Piłsudski's inaugural speech at the opening of the Legislative Sejm on February 10, 1919. This was the foundational performance, marking the symbolic birth of the modern state after 123 years of partition.
Piłsudski, the military strongman and founder of the Second Republic, his initial performance had to establish instant legitimacy for a brand new nation.
Precisely. And his second appearance on the list is even more telling regarding the transition from leadership to power. Number 2 is Józef Piłsudski's speech to parliamentary representatives after the May coup on May 29, 1926.
So this was the performance that signaled the fundamental shift in the Polish political system from parliamentary democracy toward his personal authoritarian control, the beginning of the Samonation regime.
The wordcraft in that 1926 speech must have been a highly complex act of self-justification and accusation, shifting the blame for the political instability away from his military actions and onto the incompetent democratic system.
It was a classic performance of controlling the discourse, asserting that his pure intentions justified his extra-legal actions.
Exactly. Moving toward World War II, number 3 is Joseph Beck's parliamentary speech responding to German territorial claims on May 5, 1939. This was the powerful, defiant performance of national resistance right before the collapse.
A symbol of Polish sovereignty.
And then number 4 is Stefan Starzycki's last radio address to Warsaw residents during the siege on September 23, 1939. This is the quintessential wartime performance of solidarity and heroism, a raw, emotional marawa delivered under duress, solidifying the idea of an unwavering national spirit.
Then we enter the communist period, where performances become mandates rather than pleas for voluntary support.
They do. Number 5 is Józef Sienkiewicz's speech after the Poznan events, June 29, 1956. This was a critical performance of damage control delivered after significant anti-regime worker protests. It marked a necessary internal struggle within the communist regime, attempting to reestablish party control while acknowledging social unrest.
And then Gomułka comes back.
All right, number 6, Władysław Gomułka's massive speech at Defilade Square on October 24, 1956. This was a key moment of re-legitimization. Gomułka returned to power, promising reform and a brief perceived thaw in relations with Moscow.
So his performance here, though still rooted in communist ideology, was designed to garner necessary popular accreditation through nationalist appeals before reverting to his technical controlling style.
You've got it. Then the repressive turn comes with the Jaruzelski. Number 7, Wojciech Jaruzelski's announcement of martial law on December 13, 1981.
A chilling performance of state necessity.
Using the rhetoric of crisis and unavoidable historical imperative to justify a severe repressive turn. It's a clear example of the autocrat's strategy of using rationality to mask coercion.
And the shift back to democracy.
Number 8, Tadeusz Mazowiecki's exposé in the Sejm on September 12, 1989. This was a symbolic moment of profound change, ushering in the first non-communist government since the war. As an exposé, its wordcraft focused intensely on setting the policy map for an entirely new democratic reality.
Then the final 2 bring us closer to the present.
Number 9 is Aleksander Kwaśniewski's speech on Poland, officially joining the European Union, May 1, 2004. This speech was a performance of successful national redirection, celebrating a historical goal and positioning Poland firmly within the European political structure.
And the last one.
And finally, number 10, Radosław Sikorski's speech in Berlin, defining Germany's place in Europe, from November 28, 2011. This was a foreign policy performance, setting out a clear, proactive vision for Poland's role in the regional security and political architecture.
This roadmap shows an overwhelming preference for speeches delivered at moments of high national crisis, regime change, or international transition. The key speeches are performances that fundamentally restructure the collective reality.
And this brings us back to what experts defined as effectiveness. They cited 5 criteria for judging the best and worst speakers, which act as the performance metrics for political legitimacy.
What were these crucial performance metrics?
They looked at 1. Substance. Was the content adapted to the circumstances? Was it appropriate for the time and place? And did it offer solutions? 2. Cohesion and clarity. Was the speaker articulate, focused, and organized in their presentation? 3. Style. Was the delivery engaging, dynamic, and passionate, or was it monotonous and dry? This is pure stagecraft.
In the last 2.
4. Linguistic culture. Was the language correct, elegant, and appropriate, or was it vulgar or colloquial? And 5. Effectiveness. Did the speech achieve its purpose? Was it able to connect with and successfully move the audience? This is the ultimate test of voluntary accreditation.
It's fascinating how those criteria sometimes conflict. You could score high on substance and linguistic culture, but completely fail on style and effectiveness.
That's where the performance breaks down. A classic example cited by experts was Przemysław Żukiewicz, who was judged as one of the worst speakers by some experts. His wordcraft, the substance and linguistic correctness, was often deemed perfectly appropriate and cohesive. However, he failed purely on the criteria of engagement. His delivery was characterized by a monotonous style and a lack of emotional connection, meaning his stagecraft was perceived as profoundly ineffective.
The audience refused the accreditation because the performance was boring regardless of the quality of the script.
Essentially, yes. This shows that the political performance is holistic. You can't separate the message from the delivery.
And it confirms the non-confirmation of the identity hypothesis one last time.
How so?
Notice that appealing to the collective values of the community is not listed as one of the top 5 criteria. The criteria are overwhelmingly centered on technical competence and effective communication, whether the performance achieves its immediate, situated goal.
That's a great point.
This deep dive has fundamentally changed how we should view political communication. It's never just about policy, it's a careful, calculated performance built on wordcraft and stagecraft, constantly shifting based on the immediate context of power or the lack thereof.
The research confirms that leadership performance is always context-dependent. The way a leader builds credibility, whether through simulated authenticity, authoritarian command, or pure spectacle changes, based entirely on whether they are the challenger, the new incumbent, or the entrenched autocrat. The stage determines the performance, and the goal is always to secure that voluntary accreditation from the audience, or, failing that, to justify the use of coercion.
So the final thought for you, the learner. If the ability to confirm one's leadership depends heavily on the stage of one's career and the resources available, the coercive tools of power or the lack thereof, rather than a consistent set of identity values, what does that imply for modern political systems obsessed with electing authentic leaders? Does authenticity matter more than performance, or is authenticity just the latest, most effective form of performance used to secure that crucial voluntary accreditation? That is the question we are left with as we analyze the stage of politics today.